We are here in our, what is technically second week of our series on Deuteronomy. For those who were not here last week or who are visiting, we have embarked now on our expository series on the book of Deuteronomy. We've just finished a series on doxology, that is to say worship of God, prior to Easter and Holy Week. Then coming back after Holy Week, we are now beginning our series, working our way through from the very beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, all the way through as far as we can get to the end. This will, of course, take up much of our time for the rest of this year, and we'll have the distinct advantage, as I mentioned last week, of knowing what is coming the next week, which is one of the advantages of expository preaching, in that we finish, say for verse 5 this morning, we know that we're beginning where next week? Verse 6. It usually helps us to have that kind of consistency in teaching. It also allows you to read through the coming week's passage, at least knowing where to begin. You may not know where we'll end it, but you at least know what verse we're beginning in. Last week, we simply gave an overview of the book of Deuteronomy. We marched our way through for about 20 odd minutes or so, nearly half an hour, as I kind of gave you the Cliff Notes version of the first 4 books of the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, authored by Moses. And so I traversed our way trying to give you as brief a summary as I could in half an hour of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and the book of Numbers, before we then arrived here at Deuteronomy. We saw the fact that going all the way back into the earliest chapters of Genesis, we find this travailing story winding its way down through history, wherein God is demonstrating his covenant faithfulness consistently to his people. We see it, of course, in seminal figures like Adam. We see it again in figures like Noah, again in figures like Abraham and his descendants as well. And we find consistently throughout that this promise given, a promise given to Adam, to Noah, to Abraham, and to his descendants also, that through this line, this seed is the image used in Hebrew there, right, referring to offspring, God would bless not only his people, but indeed all the nations of the earth. This was given in this kind of climactic setting, of course, particularly to Abraham. We then, after having done that for about half an hour, working our way through Exodus as well as the vital need for the book of Leviticus, the fact that it seems foreign to our modern, Western, post-Enlightenment mind, but indeed is actually a great book of blessing because it paved the way by which the people of Israel were able to actually commune in the mere presence or proximity of God in the first place. It then came to the book of Numbers, which is called so because it begins with a numbering of the people, right, a census, where God counts how many of the different tribes there are and their numbers. And then they spend this 40 years wandering through the deserts and the various deserts up as they head north from Mount Sinai, otherwise known as Mount Horeb, which we have referenced here in Deuteronomy, and then up into the eastern side of the Jordan River, okay, in the land of the Amorite kingdoms, which are what then goes on to get discussed, particularly in chapter 2. This morning we're just covering this introductory little incipit that we find here in the first 5 verses of Deuteronomy that kind of set the stage for this first speech, because what we saw last week in the overview was that Deuteronomy can essentially be boiled down to 3 speeches that Moses gives. He is at the end of his life. They are again stationed in the land of Moab, right, east of the Jordan River, before they then cross over under the command of Moses' successor named Joshua, which is where the next book, of course, begins with Joshua. And we find here that at his last or latter stages of his life, he gives this final admonition and encouragement and warning and everything else in between to the Israelites and to particularly this new generation. He is primarily speaking to this new generation, those born in the travelling during the wilderness, because their parents had sinned, they had rebelled against God multiple times, and indeed were then facing the justice of not being allowed to enter into the promised land, okay? As with Moses, and we covered that in the overview last week. Here we come to the first of these speeches, which essentially runs from chapters 1 through to 11, roughly. Again, that's the broad breakdown. It breaks down even more kind of into smaller parcels than that as well, but the broad breakdown is these 3 speeches given, chapters 1 to 11, We then have 12 to 26, which is what we call the Deuteronomic Code, or the Law Code, which we look forward to getting onto. And then chapters 27 all the way through to the end in chapter 34 is the final speech, and of course Moses' death in chapter 34. Here he begins in this particular way. So look with me in verse 1 of chapter 1. These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness, in the land of Arava, opposite Suf, between Paran and Tophel and Lavan and Hatzeroth and Ditzahav. As we have seen throughout the service, we read a sizable chunk of Numbers chapter 33, which is this, and it is concise, it goes for 50 verses in total, but what is ultimately a concise description of all of their journeyings. Many of you, I can guess, even sitting up the back as I was, had your eyes progressively roll further back into your head as you read these various Hebrew words which mean nothing to you in any way, shape or form. This is quite understandable because Christians in medieval times, one sitting, say, in England, would have also had equally as much knowledge of these places, which is almost precisely zero. The fact is that when we come to this book, and the reason why we worked our way through those readings from from Numbers chapter 33, was to highlight what's ultimately being pointed to here this morning, but moreover, to demonstrate the fact of how we should actually read the Old Testament scriptures. All too often, as a very broad point which applies not only to this morning's text, not only to Numbers chapter 33, but really to a lot of the Old Testament, is that we tend to approach it with very modern Western eyes. That is to say, we observe and we read things through the lens of our own context, our own language, our own way of thinking, which is shaped by many, many different factors, not only religiously but culturally as well. For many of us, it seems, why on earth would the author of Numbers 33 go through and list all of these various places that we have no idea about? We know where many of them are. Some of them we're not quite sure. We know a general ballpark, and that goes for things like this here as well. Arava, the Arava, which means the wilderness or the gap, is broadly speaking describing the region between the Gulf of Aqaba, which is part of the Red Sea that was crossed by the Israelites during the Exodus, up to the Dead Sea, okay, which is obviously the southern end of the River Jordan. Okay, it's this broad area of wilderness which has many different kind of sub-areas or sub-regions that are referred to by various names. The desert of sin, not sin as in to sin against God, but sin as in the Hebrew or Semitic word sin. You have other deserts as well, which are just generically referred to as the wilderness. And you have these kinds of places here like Paran and Tophel and Lavan and Hatzeroth and Ditzahav. Again, some of them we know where they are. Some of them we've done a lot of archaeological work on excavating those sites. Some of them we don't know where they are. We have a ballpark idea, but we haven't found the specific remains from this time period. The thing is that that's not the issue. Even as I sit here talking to you about what we haven't found archaeologically, is in itself a very modern Western way of approaching the biblical texts. When these were authored, when these were read by the audience to whom they were actually given, everyone would have known where these places were. They also would have known where these places approximately were, even if they weren't 100% sure. Even if they're coming down 1,000 years later, now the descendants by the time of the exile to Babylon would have been told down throughout the generations all the stories that we have here, in this case in Deuteronomy, or in other places like Numbers chapter 33. But what the authors are doing there, and what Moses is doing, is describing the various journey and demonstrating the great wonder of how God has faithfully brought his people through this incredible winding journey of an escape and exodus from Egypt, and how they have then wandered through all these various places of wilderness across the Red Sea in the Arava, in the wilderness, in the desert lands. and demonstrating the broader point that is this: God has remained faithful to his people. He is Yahweh, he is the covenant God, and he is the one who has made covenant and, more importantly, kept covenant with his people. As we saw last week in our kind of introduction or our highlight, so much of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, are, among many other things, the interplay between the faithfulness of God and the unfaithfulness of his people. Here we have this kind of codified for us, what is that broader list in Numbers 33, down thankfully into all but a couple of verses in this incipit, that is to say this opening here of Deuteronomy chapter 1. He does so particularly when he gets to verse 2, and then in contrast to what comes after that in verse 3. Read in verse 2, "It is 11 days' journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea." Right? What we have is a description. Horeb, by the way, is just the synonymous word with Mount Sinai. So when you read Horeb and Sinai, that's the same mountain. There's a couple of different theories as to why they were 2 names, but that part's aside this morning. Horeb is Sinai. So the journey from Horeb by way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea, which is one of the places they stopped off before then coming back down and then heading north, is demonstrating how short of a distance it actually is. One of the common questions that I get theologically is, why on earth did this Exodus and this journey, particularly through the book of Numbers, take 40 years? Right? Without reading the broader context, of what it says, because we're told very clearly why it took 40 years, but without seeing the bigger picture of these books, you will ask questions like, why on earth did it take 40 years to travel really what is a couple of weeks' journey? Not even, barely 2. Again, Kadesh Barnea is about halfway to the land of Moab, right, the land of the Amorite kings, east of the Jordan, which is where they currently are, right here, right now, when Moses is giving this final speech and speeches at the end of his life. It's really maybe a 2-week journey, three-ish week journey probably, in terms of just as the crow flies. Why on earth did it take 40 years? Well, we're told the rebellion of the people, and the rebellion then particularly of the Levite priests during what's called the rebellion of Korah, brought down upon them justice. Because what we see through Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers particularly is that while God is covenantally faithful, while he does not abandon his people, while he is in fact, as the Old Testament consistently describes to us, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in chesed in the Hebrew, what we call steadfast love or covenantal faithfulness, he also does not somehow lose sight of his justice. His justice is consistently applied because justice and love are not mutually exclusive. In fact, not only are they not mutually exclusive, there is no genuine justice without love, nor is there genuine love without true justice. And so whilst he remains covenantally faithful to his people, he does not abandon them, he does not forsake them, he does not leave them to simply wander and die in the wilderness alone. He maintains his covenant faithfulness while also administering justice. The sins of his people do not nor cannot go unpunished. They must be dealt with, as must ours. Thankfully for us and for them, the sacrificing of lambs and of bulls in the desert would not suffice, but instead, what? Christ, the true Lamb of God, came and sacrificed himself once and for all to atone for the sins of his people. And we live, fortunately, on this side of that great and awesome sacrifice that was made. Here, we find Moses, particularly in verse 2, contrasting what then comes in verse 3. Now it happened in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, Moses spoke to the children of Israel according to all that Yahweh had commanded him to give to them. Right, you see what he's doing? He's contrasting the relative shortness of the journey as it actually is, 11 days, right? Not that it necessarily took them 11 days, but it's an 11-day journey if you're just traveling there from where they were down at the Gulf of Aqaba up to Kadesh Barnea, which is about halfway approximately to where they are now in the land of Moab. Right? So you can see the relative distance being shown. This is not a long journey. But they took 40 years because that was the punishment given for their rebellion, for their attempt to very democratically overthrow Moses, as well as the rebellion of the priesthood, right, the tribe of the Levites. Okay? The other factor that has to be taken into consideration, which is one of the points here, is this. You have a generation of hundreds of thousands of people at the minimum who have been descended from people who were descended from people who were descended from people who were brought into slavery 400 years before them. This is centuries and centuries on end of not only cultural formation, but indeed spiritual or religious formation. Their very worldview of the earth, that is to say the world that they live in, was shaped by centuries of Egyptian culture and of pagan religion. Centuries of darkness. Before then, light came to them, not only figuratively speaking, but also literally, as God appearing in the burning bush to Moses in Exodus chapter 3. And light being one of those consistent images that we've talked about many, many times here. It is the seminal image, other than the seed. Light is the seminal image in the Old Testament that is contrasted with darkness. And the interplay between light and darkness, right, good and evil, truth, lies, etc., is what we find weaving our way through all the text of the Old Testament. But you have this kind of setting that just doesn't get magically resolved in all but 11 days. They needed, in one sense at least, to wean off of 400 years of slavery and entrapment in the darkness of Egypt. And we find then that, of course, this first generation didn't do that. Right? They rebelled. And so what we have coming here, now here in Deuteronomy, in this fifth and final book of Moses, is him talking to the new generation who have been born along this journey, but who are now kind of coming of age and have now come of age and are now ready for the next step in God's great redemptive plan that works and marches its way through history. They're now the ones who will, under the leadership of the new generational leader, Joshua, cross the Jordan fully as the people and begin the conquest of Canaan and enter into the land that was promised to their ancestor, Abraham, and to his descendants. It's being contrasted here, the shortness of the actual journey with how long it actually took. What Moses is doing here is highlighting to them what becomes a big theme, not only through this first speech, but also particularly the last speech that he gives from chapter 27 through to the end of the book, which is that of warning. This book is not short on warnings. In fact, there's warnings left, right, and centre. Because he is dutifully warning the people as the mouthpiece of God that he is, as the oracle of God, to not go the way of their fathers. Right? Do not abandon the covenant that was made. Do not be unfaithful to all that God, to all that Yahweh, your covenant God, has done for you. Obey the laws, for they are good and holy and wise, and they are the only thing that is conducive to human flourishing. That is a fact that still remains to this day, and one that we will obviously cover in more detail when we get on to chapter 12 and onward. But he's warning them to remain faithful to the covenant. Do not abandon it, lest God have to bring down justice upon you as well. This is the warning given, and he's doing this by contrasting the relative geographical shortness of the journey with the fact that it took 40 years for this to actually take place in reality and in history. We're told that this is the place where he speaks to the children of Israel according to all that Yahweh had commanded him to give them. Again, the other thing that's consistently been the picture, particularly through Exodus, or the latter half of Exodus, and especially through Leviticus, is that what we have is God giving covenant to his people. It is God who first approached Moses, not the other way around. It is God who called Moses up upon Mount Sinai, not the other way around. It is God who has been guiding them and directing them through the wilderness, not the other way around. It's the consistent demonstration of God's faithfulness to his people. And here he is giving Moses, who is the proverbial prophet and priest and king in a functionary sense, to the people. He is giving Moses all that he has commanded his people to do. And he has done it for good reason. I mentioned it earlier in brevity. But it is because what we have in the covenant is good. We suffer in our day and age, and this will become a consistent theme throughout this series, but we suffer in our day from what we refer to in theological terms as antinomianism. Right? It's a simple enough word. You're already seeing part of it on the screen above you. We explained last week the meaning of Deuteronomy, deuteros, second, nomos, law in the Greek. Right? The second law. Not because it's a different law, but because it's the second giving of the law. Of course, the first was at Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 20, which is where we get the 10 Commandments. Right? Here now he is giving it for the second time to the new generation. But antinomianism, antinomos, against the law, is what we tend to have. There is a greater prevailing ethos, let's just call it that, among too many evangelical churches that strays away from not only an actual adherence to the moral commands of God, but indeed an actual theological or philosophical valuing thereof. I cannot tell you how many times I have had conversations with people, young and old, who have said something to the effect of, we are not under law, we are under grace, which is of course hearkening to the words of the Apostle Paul, whilst horrifically taking them grossly out of context. Because if one reads what the Apostle continues to say, he in fact says most ardently and most poignantly, to paraphrase, do not think that you can go on sinning simply because we are no longer under the curse or the burden of the law. And he gives an exclamation which we tend to translate as God forbid. Right? It's even stronger than that in the Greek. But nonetheless, he is saying, God forbid, no, goodness gracious, do not think that somehow the law has just been done away with. That somehow right and wrong are now just under this vague, vacuous, mysterious kind of mist called grace, which somehow obscures or does away with that. Christ our Lord himself, did he not say, think not that I have come to abolish the law, no, I have come to fulfill it. But indeed he has not abolished the law. The law is good and is wise, as the hymn says. It is what is good. It is righteous, not as a taskmaster, which is what the Apostle Paul's point is, but indeed that we are now saved unto good works, to use the Apostle James' words. The people here, through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, through definitely the book of Judges, and through many other books that we find down throughout the history of God's people in the Old Testament, is good, but indeed the people fail to uphold it. They failed to actually live up to the righteous moral standards and commands of God, which proceed forth from his very nature and attributes. We saw that last year in our series on the attributes of God, which we did for about 6 months there. But indeed now, on this side of Christ, how on earth do we understand these very same concepts? Well, by the grace of God, we have been born again. We have been regenerated, to use the theological term. We've been justified before God by his grace alone, through faith and repentance. That is to say, trusting in the sacrifice of Christ alone for the salvation of our souls. And that faith itself is but a gift from God. right? Lest anyone should boast of our own good works or our own having faith. And indeed then, we're not just punching our ticket to heaven and kind of kicking back on the chaise longue and just relaxing, but instead, we actually now have the ability to be faithful to God. And we have that by, as the imagery that's used in the scriptures throughout, God removing our heart of stone, right, that hard heart that is stiff and that is stubborn and that is rebellious, and replacing it with a heart of flesh, right? It's symbolism, obviously, it's imagery, but it's describing something very real. A heart that is pumping with blood, with life, that is malleable, that is able to be formed and to be fashioned, that is able to be receptive and shaped. Do we fail? Every day. Every day. And if you don't think you have, before you even got here this morning, then it demonstrates the fact that even we, myself included, tend to undervalue our own standing before God and our own ability to actually uphold that law. But by God's grace, we have been accounted with Christ's righteousness. And it is his righteousness, his perfect obedience to the law, to this very law, which is then credited to us. And we now have the freedom and the liberty not to just do whatever we want, but to obey God. We have the freedom and we have the liberty now to actually be faithful. That is the true definition of liberty, by the way. That's what liberty used to mean in the West. It doesn't mean that anymore. Today, liberty and freedom simply mean this kind of laissez-faire, libertarian, I get to do whatever I want. That's what liberty and freedom has become. But again, we'll talk about that more when we get through Deuteronomy. Here, he is calling upon them to be faithful to the covenant. And again, it's in the context of history. If you have there, look in verse 4 with me. He's giving these commands to the children of Israel. He's speaking to them. Verse 4, after he had struck down, he referring to God, referring to Yahweh, who was just previously mentioned in the sentence before. After he, Yahweh, had struck down Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, the king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth and Edrei. He's recounting to them these famous victories which have already occurred here in the latter, from this perspective, the latter chapters of the book of Numbers. Okay? We're going to talk about that more because this gets recounted specifically in the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3. So I'm not going to talk about it much here this morning. Right? We'll get onto that when we get to those chapters 2 and 3 in a couple of weeks' time. But here what he's doing is recounting a very explicit example of that covenant faithfulness of God. They had now marched up north into the land of Moab, which is then described, if you look there in verse 5, across the Jordan in the land of Moab. Moses undertook to expounding this law. They're here in the land of, at this time, the kingdoms of the Amorites. There are many Amorite kingdoms. There were two major ones, those ruled by Sihon and Og, two respective kings in those lands that run from, on the eastern side of the Jordan, the Sea of Galilee in the north, down to the Dead Sea in the south. Right, which you'll be more familiar with from other parts of the Old and New Testaments. That's broadly speaking. It's a bit bigger than that, but that's roughly speaking where we're talking about here. And that's where they are. By this point, they've already conquered Sihon and Og and their respective armies. They didn't come there to defeat their armies. In fact, they actually asked permission to move through the lands. And it was, in fact, King Sihon who assembled his army and attacked the Israelites with almost certainly greater numbers, and if not greater numbers, then definitively much, much, much better warriors. Far greater warriors. And in fact, these two figures were known. Again, many of the Amorite kings were known, even more broadly than just the Israelites. They were known around Mesopotamia, they were known to the Egyptians. These were fearsome warriors. Their kings were kings that, and don't hold your breath here, but this is a staggering fact. Kings that actually got out and fought with their people, right? who actually didn't sit in an air-conditioned office, but instead actually got out and did things with and for their people. That's what kings used to do. Not so much these days, but nonetheless. Here, they were great and fearsome warriors, right? They were gigantic men who were fearsome and were terrifying to the Israelites. But instead what happens? Well, the Israelite armies, they conquer them. They conquer Sihon and Og, the two respective Amorite kings of the lands east of the Jordan, in the lands of Moab. And so now here, this generation, which would have been kind of kids and at least coming of age in their late years, would have not been the ones fighting almost entirely. They instead would have been hearkening back to those conquests. They haven't occurred, decades ago, but they've occurred in recent years. But again, this is the new generation. He's pointing them to explicit examples of God's faithfulness. The fact that already they have won considerable underdog battles, if you want to use a modern term. They have come up against very fearsome enemies in their day, and they have already won two major campaigns, essentially, against King Sihon and against King Og, right? And that this would then set the stage, literally and figuratively, for the conquest of Canaan, where they would then move into the land of Canaan, crossing the Jordan, heading west into the land of Canaan, where they would face just as greater enemies, if not even greater, where they would face even more fearsome warriors, where they would face more terrifying armies, right? And that would require what? Faith. Not a kind of vacuous, ethereal faith that's built on nice ideas and wishful hopes, but rather it's based on what? The faithfulness of God. That's based on what God has clearly demonstrated himself to have done, what he has consistently been demonstrating himself to have done, as he's pointing to in this specific example of these two major victorious battles that they've already had. That when they would cross the Jordan, they would then need that exact resolute faith, that they would need to be, as God commands Joshua, strong and courageous, that they must not fear, because fear is driven by unfaithfulness. We don't like to say that much these days, but biblically speaking, you cannot come to any other conclusion. A resolute faith, not in yourself or your own purported abilities, but rather in God's nature, that is to say his character, as well as his demonstrable actions, his evident actions, is where your faith should and indeed must be applied. Placing your faith in him, not even faith in your own sense or feeling of faith, because now you are looking inward as opposed to outward, which is where we must look. But here, having faith in God and trusting that he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that he is indeed steadfast in his love or his covenant faithfulness, is what the call is to all of God's people. And it is what the call is here specifically to the new generation of Israelites. Remember the conquests that God has achieved through the Israelite armies. See what he's already done. We've already brought down, to paraphrase Moses here, these great Amorite kings, these two. And there are going to be many, many more on the other side of that river. But indeed, God is with you because he's already demonstrated so resolutely for decades and decades and decades, just talking about from the Exodus, to your fathers and to your grandfathers, and to your mothers and your grandmothers. He's demonstrated his faithfulness even beyond that, to Abraham and to Noah and to Adam and everyone else in between. But in this particular context and this point of history, this point of redemptive history, he has demonstrated this. And so then he calls them to listen to the law that's being given, which is essentially what he's saying there in verse 5. What we find then, to finish, is he then launches into this law. Right? He does it particularly from chapters 12 onward, but here he's expounding upon the need to maintain this law. Right? And so we'll then begin next week in verse 6, which is where he then begins to speak. Okay? What I encourage you to do, and this will be a general encouragement, so I won't need to kind of keep saying it, but read through the book of Deuteronomy. Probably a helpful idea, right? Read through it and keep reading through it. You don't need to blitz your way through it. You don't need to have an entire section or chapter completed by the next week. But what I encourage you to do is start reading the book of Deuteronomy. Begin in chapter 1, verse 1. Work your way through. Work your way through at a pace that works for you, right? And then eventually, hopefully, over the coming months that we work our way through this book, you will have actually, in fact, ended up reading this probably multiple times by the time you work your way through over the course of months. Dive into this book. There is so much great richness in not only the history, but the theology particularly, that is to be found in the book of Deuteronomy. It's one of the many reasons why we have chosen to undertake this work of expounding this great book. So begin reading it. Meditate upon it, pray through it, learn from it. If you come across things you don't know, which will definitely happen, then that's good, because it means there is scope and room for learning. You can always ask me in advance. If it's coming up, hopefully you'll be able to wait all but a week or a couple of weeks until we cover it. If it's in chapter 30, you'll have to wait a while, so I'll answer it there and then. But nonetheless, start working your way through, so that we as a church can really dive deep into it, as I said, and we can draw out from this as a family and as a community the incredible richness of the treasure of faith that is found herein. Amen.